going to turn this over to you. Yeah, please tell the story, Brilliana.
Well, it's a delight to be with all of you this afternoon, and good to see some very familiar faces and some new ones. So the talk today is on a Puritan lady whose life coincides with probably one of the most tumultuous eras of British history, which is the Civil Wars that Britain was involved in the period from 1638 is when we really do have the first outbreak of war. There had been some fighting before in Ireland, but the two bishops, what are called the Bishops' Wars, in which the King, Charles I, unwisely sought to impose Anglicanism and the Book of Common Prayer upon the Church of Scotland, resulted in two wars with the Scots, both of which he lost. And that produced a crisis because he had been governing England during the 1630s by himself without the use of Parliament. And a constitutional crisis emerged in which he needed money to pay off war reparations to the Scots, which initiated the 1642 outbreak of the First English Civil War, which would last ultimately through to 1651, with two further phases of fighting in the entirety of the British and Irish archipelago. And so Brilliana Harley's life is against this background. And what I want to do then is sketch something, really kind of do an introduction, a brief biographical sketch of Brilliana, and then again to bring up also the element of the kind of larger context in which she was lived, and then look at a number of her letters to her son, Edward, as a model of what we would describe today as spiritual formation. One of the things I've been thinking about in significant measure in recent days is we have a lot of information about how ministers were trained and mentored and formed in this period, the 17th and 18th centuries.
Okay. Oops.
Well, I think I had a bit of a crash there. Sorry.
Okay, I still see you,
can you still hear me?
We hear you, but the PowerPoint looks to be has been lost. You want to?
Yeah, give me a sec here. I may have to go out and back in again.
Yeah, no problem. I'll keep an eye.
Yeah, my apologies.
Yeah, and yeah, well, Michael's doing that. I've got Mike was down to visit the Oak Center last week and came bearing gifts, a whole bag full of books that we'll be having available. But for instance, this one, Spirituality of Oliver Cromwell, fascinating study. The actually one on George Whitefield. These are incredibly well written and very accessible studies. I think Brilliana is probably one of the first of the women in these series, but Michael has done a book called Women of Faith, 8 Women of Faith, which are very, very powerful sketches of key figures, including Jane Austen is the last one in there, but very fascinating study. And I think these will all be down at the Oak Center, but you can order them online, or if you're a student of Michael's, you can probably get them there at the Seminary as well. But this series is particularly good, and many people I've not even heard. I've got a pile of them, but this is the Joy Unspeakable and Full of Glory, and that's the Piety of Samuel and Sarah Pierce. And I have to admit, I don't know much about either, but I'll certainly learn a lot reading this book. And I'd say the one on George Whitefield, fascinating study. And I think Michael has a gift. I'm still waiting to see him come back in for bringing to life figures, what seemed just of the distant past. Like, who are these people? We realize that God was at work very powerfully in the lives of many in that generation and in the subsequent period, and then leading up to after the close of the Puritan period. We had the revival with Wesley and Whitefield and a whole subsequent development that really hugely impacted the Victorian period and on. We go through Spurgeon and so forth. So there's a really strong lineage there. I think, David, you mentioned you've been involved with Reformed Baptist movement quite. You knew, I guess, here's Michael, John Riesinger. Did you know John?
I had met him.
Okay.
And
Walter
I knew
Chantry,
Ernie.
I guess. Oh,
I knew Ernie Riesinger. I'm primarily in the Banner of Truth camp. Those are my guys.
Good.
And Walt Chantry was a mentor, but always spoke highly of a lot of the Reformed Baptist men up in Canada. And,
right.
So I try to learn more of that when I can.
No, excellent. Yeah, indeed. And it was actually John Riesinger that introduced me to a lot of material. Don Leggett and Bill Payne. I don't know if you know Bill Payne.
Is that big Bill Payne?
Well, I don't. He didn't seem that big to me. He died, unfortunately, relatively young, but he was at the Calvary Baptist.
I think I heard him once at a conference, and
British.
He was a large guy. Yeah, big Bill Payne.
Okay, welcome back, Michael.
Yeah, I apologize. I'm not sure what happened there, but anyway. So let me pick up where I left off.
All right.
So what I'd like to do then is look at Brilliana Harley, an overview of her life, and then really kind of focus on elements of what we would describe as spiritual formation. As I was saying, we have a fair understanding of how ministers were mentored. A lot of time and energy has been spent on understanding the curricula at the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, or what we call the dissenting academies that emerged in the wake of dissenters being kicked out of the Church of England post 1662. The sort of books they read, what they wrote, etc. But the big question I've been thinking about a lot is how are men and women in the pew formed in their Christian lives? And so really what I'm looking at here is the way in which a mother mentors her son and seeks to bring him to a position of strength and standing in his Christian life, that he can basically pursue holiness and Christian maturity. And so really the theme that I'm looking at the end of the lecture, the last really half of the lecture, is spiritual formation in the context of the home and the importance of the family as a place for mentoring men and women. So let me begin then. Brilliana Harley.
You want to put up the PowerPoint, Michael? Or is it...
Yes, let me share the PowerPoint. Thank you.
Yeah.
Give me a sec here.
That's a very fascinating PowerPoint, and I'll send that to all of you after as well. There we go.
There we go. And I will have recourse to the PowerPoint in a few minutes. That actually is the main portrait of Brilliana done in her lifetime. And the technical title of the paper is The Affective Piety. That is piety that is rooted and grounded in the affections of Brilliana Harley, domestic courage in an age of revolution. So the Puritan penchant for curious names for their children is very well known. We have inherited some of those still today. Hope, faith, charity. These names that are used for young women or girls are a product of the Puritan era. But there are other weirder names. For instance, the Puritan commentator William Greenhill had a relative whose name, a baby girl, whose name was Hate Evil, hate-evil, Greenhill, who was baptized in April of 1661. Another famous Puritan, Edward Paulhill, his mother's name was Fate Not Paulhill. It turns out that Fate Not was actually quite a common girl's name, and it did die away in the late 1600s. And there are also weirder ones. Praise God, bare bones. Christ came into the world to save sinners, bare bones, his brother, etc. And certainly not as bizarre as these girls' names is Brilliana Harley. Brilliana is a very unusual name, and in fact, apart from the Harley family, I've never come across it anywhere else. I'll say a little bit about her name, which will then lead us into looking at her background.
Right.
Brilliana was born in 1598 in the seaport, and this is where she gets her name, of Brill, or Brielle in Dutch, near Rotterdam. She was the daughter of Edward Conway, who was a aristocrat. He was descended from nobility. William I, Henry II, William the Conqueror would be distant ancestors of her father and therefore her. Edward Conway and his wife, Dorothy Tracy Conway. He was at the time the governor of Brill. And it's odd, obviously, thinking that an Englishman is governing a Dutch town, but it all goes back to the fact that during the long War of Independence that the Dutch fought against their Spanish overlords during the 16th century, the British sought to help the English, sought to help the Dutch, and in return, the Dutch gave them control of 3 seaports, which would enable them to bring troops across easily, not have to run through things like customs, whatever, supplies. And they expected the ports to hand it back in due course. They were eventually handed back, but not immediately. Not as immediately as the Dutch would have hoped. But all that aside, this is where she's born, and her father thought it brilliant, pun intended, to name her Brilliana after her, the place of her birth. We don't know much about her early years. Her education definitely included French. In fact, later, and we'll see this in one of the texts that I will bring, she will indicate that she was much more comfortable reading French than reading English. It would also have included Latin, and she would use her knowledge of Latin to tutor her own sons when she realized that the local schoolmaster where she is living after she gets married to Robert Harley is unreliable. She was well read also in contemporary theological literature. She had what one author, Wallace Notestein, who was an American historian at Yale University, he described her reading ability and interests as, quote, having a continental breadth, end of quote. When she was in her mid-20s, she married Robert Harley. Born in 1579, he would die in 1656. She marries him on July the 16th, 1623. And let me bring up the PowerPoint here. There's Brilliana's father. That also indicates the place where she was born in the Netherlands, near the coast. And that's a contemporary 16th century picture of the harbor at Brill, and then some of the architecture that you can see there, distinct Dutch architecture. And here is Robert Harley, whom she marries on July the 16th, 1623. The painting on the left is a Vermeer, a contemporary. He's the Dutch painter, and some of his paintings of domestic life are absolutely gorgeous. And I'm just using that as kind of an illustration of the period. Robert Harley was a fairly prominent figure in the area that he lived in. That is Herefordshire, a very small village called Brampton Bryan, Brampton, and then Bryan, Bryan. Brampton Bryan in northwestern Herefordshire, which is right on the Welsh border. And his estate was on a central route, a major route into central Wales, and that will be of a significance, as we will see in our story. By the time that he marries Brilliana, and he's 40 when he marries, he's in his 40s when he marries Brilliana, mid-40s. He has already been twice married and twice widowed. His first wife had died giving birth to their first child. The child had also died, and that was Anne Barrett. She died really in childbirth. And then he married Mary Newport, who bore him 9 children, all of whom died.
Wow.
And he buried before the age of 2. And so when he marries Brilliana, he has had 10 children, none of whom are living, and has been twice widowed. The faith of the family had obviously been, if you go back in the Middle Ages, traditionally Catholic, but it was his mother, Margaret Corbett Harley, who had been a committed Puritan, and had taken great care to hand on her Protestant faith to our family. And it was shaped by this faith that Robert Harley would become a fairly prominent Presbyterian during the 1600s. At his funeral, the presiding minister, a man named Thomas Freusel, commented that Harley had been, quote, a great saint by grace, end of quote. And, quote, if other saints are candles, he was a torch. The lecture is not about Robert Harley, but if it were, we would have to talk about the way in which he encouraged gospel preaching throughout Herefordshire. And being the protege, being the kind of patron of a number of gospel ministers, men like John Toombs in Leominster, spelt Leominster, Leominster, but spelt actually pronounced Leominster. John Toombs was a very significant transitional figure in this period between Puritanism and Baptist convictions. And Harley was responsible for bringing a variety of these men into Herefordshire to make sure there was gospel preaching in various villages and towns. On April the 24th, 1643, the Parliament placed him in charge. This is now in the middle of the Civil War, placed him in charge of a newly created committee, committee technically known as the Committee for the Demolition of Monuments of Superstition and Idolatry. We've, at least here in Canada, we've gone through the entire North America, we've gone through a season of pulling down statues for a variety of reasons. Well, this is what he was doing for at least 2 or 3 years in London and various cathedral towns throughout Britain. He was responsible for getting rid of crosses, communion rails, candlesticks, and all images of the Trinity, the Virgin Mary, and saints that might lead people into idolatry. And in the late, just to give a very quick overview of his later career, in the late 1640s, when Oliver Cromwell becomes a key figure in the parliamentary government, he will not be happy with Cromwell. He was not happy with the presence of the army in parliamentary politics, and he will fall out with Cromwell, and especially over the execution of the king in January of 1649. And he will be actually removed from Parliament and will spend the 1650s basically in retirement. And when the monarchy is restored in 1662, he will be a new member of Parliament, have significant role there in the midst of a very ungodly regime, that of Charles II. He would be a shining light. And there's significance in that. Well, let me talk a little bit then about Brilliana in terms of the drift of England towards civil war in the 1630s and 1640s. In 1641, as the nation began to slide towards civil war, Brilliana arranged for guards to be stationed upon the family estate. Her husband was up in London, about to be appointed to this committee, and at Parliament, and she was left in charge of the estate for many, many months. And here's the next slide, which will give you an indication of, that's an old portrait of the estate. And also you can see where the castle was, Brampton Bryan. This is where the castle, and it's a central road into it's on a main road into central Wales, and a very significant strategically. Here's two pictures of the main protagonists of the Civil Wars. On the left, Charles I, who was a king who believed in the divine right of kings. He was above the law, responsible only to God. And then on the right, really a remarkable figure, Oliver Cromwell, whose name is probably the only name from this period that would still today arouse deep abhorrence among many in Britain. And here's Brampton Bryan Castle today in a variety of seasons. As you can see, it's a ruin, and the ruin will take place during this period of the Civil War. As England begins to slide towards civil war, as I said, Brilliana arranges for guards to be stationed on the castle battlements. She also brings into the castle a large stock of bullets and weaponry. Her son, in letters to her son at the time, he was at Oxford. He was born in 1624, so he's 17 at the time. He would write to her. He didn't really think Brilliana was in any danger. He was convinced that she was overreacting. She would tell her husband, quote, "I think he is much mistaken." She was actually right. She was in great danger. Also during this period, where Brilliana lived, Brampton Bryan, is really, to some degree, in an obscure part of Britain, and she wasn't able to get news easily. And she would tell her husband that she's trying to distinguish between rumors about the possibility of the outbreak of war and real intelligence. And she told him at one point in a letter, "I take very little for certainty." She said, "Unless I know the person and I trust what they're telling me, I take it, whatever news I hear, with a grain of salt." And the next slide actually picks some of that up. There's Brilliana Harley in 1641. "I take very little for certain," she told her husband, "except what she had heard from her closest kin. She longed exceedingly," she stated, "to hear the truth of things." And she's not thinking here so much of gospel truth, but of truth about what actually is happening politically in Britain. She found herself, her husband's in London. He's got obviously business there. He's part of Parliament there. She's somewhat isolated. And this actually is a newspaper. Newspapers emerge in this period. The Mercurius Rusticus, the Country Mercury is the way we might translate that into English. And it's got a number of items there about events, one of which, interestingly enough, this is on the right side, the third picture down, Wardour Castle defended by a lady. And this is as England has entered into the period of the Civil Wars post 1642. This is a similar event to what Brilliana would go through, the besieging of her castle. But the woman in this case was a royalist, and she was being besieged by parliamentarians. Brilliana was right. She was in danger. And she was the Harleys were probably the only family in their immediate vicinity who were committed to the support of Parliament, and they were the only Puritans. The rest of the county where she was were committed to the Royalists and very firm Anglicans. And she begins in this period as England begins to slide towards civil war. Many of her friends abandon her. She could say this, and she's talking about her wealthy neighbors. "They are in mighty violence against me. I never was in such sorrows. I hope the Lord will deliver me, but they are most cruelly bent against me." For a period of time, when war breaks out in 1642, her home is not immediately attacked. And one reason for this is probably because of the great esteem in which Brilliana was held. But eventually, 8 months after the text I just read, on July the 26th, 1643, the castle was attacked and besieged by Royalist forces under the command of a man named Sir William Vavasor for 6 weeks. The castle was on a central route into Wales and needed to be taken by the Royalists to get troops into Wales. And here actually is a picture of, this is a very famous siege during this period, the siege of Basinghouse by Parliament. This is now Parliament besieging a Royalist castle. But what you can see on the contemporary artist portrait there is trenches built around the castle, where they would basically seek to prevent anybody getting in or out of the castle with supplies or weapons, and they would also bring up armament, guns, to basically reduce the castle to smithereens. So the castle then is besieged in the summer of 1643 for 6 weeks. The besieging army under the command, or the besieging regiment under the command of William Vavasor had about 700 soldiers, mixed force of cavalry and infantry. The formidable Brilliana held the castle in the face of this onslaught until September the 9th. She has in the castle her three of her children. She had 7 children, all of whom survive into adulthood. And the youngest 3, they're all girls: Dorothy, Margaret, Elizabeth. She has about 50 soldiers with her, and then about 50 civilians, and then a couple of aristocratic friends, one of whom, a Lady Colborne, had an eye shot out during the actual siege. The Royalists burned all of the buildings in the surrounding area, the village of Brampton Bryan, and the castle was bombarded every day by artillery fire. The roof of the castle was completely destroyed, so it meant that they were completely exposed to the elements, which it is the summer, so it's not cold, but they will get rained on. And despite all of that, the casualties within the castle were very low. There was only 1 death recorded, and besides Lady Colborne, a few injuries suffered. The attackers, on the other hand, the Royalists, experienced a loss of about 70 men killed or injured. At one point, Brilliana discovered that the Royalists were going to bring in grenades and try to fire the main entrance to the castle. And she sent out 10 men to find out exactly where the grenades were. They did. They discovered them and were able to blow them all up with the building in which the grenades were housed. And very audacious move. But you've got this sense of Brilliana in the castle being able to basically direct the siege. The king, Charles I, himself wrote to Brilliana on August the 21st, demanding her to surrender, but she refused. In her reply to the king, her reply is very interesting. She stated, the king had made promises, many solemn promises. This is when he was made crowned king, that he would maintain the laws and liberties of this kingdom. I cannot then think that he would give a command to take anything away from his loyal subject. She's describing herself as a loyal subject, and much less to take away my house. I must endeavor to keep what is mine as well as I can, in which I have the law of nature, of reason, and of the land on my side, and you, that is the king, none to take it from me. In other words, she affirms that the right of private property cannot be seized by the monarch willy-nilly, and that she has a right by the law and by the law of nature, natural law, and by human reason. She needs a place to live, etc., etc. The siege was eventually lifted on September the 9th when the Royalists, failing to take the city, the castle, left and joined an attack on the city of Gloucester. The captain of the soldiers who is there in the castle, Priam Davies, Again, an interesting name, Priam, the king in the Iliad, the king of Troy in the Iliad. Later described the effects of the siege and Brilliana's fortitude. All our bread was ground with a hand mill. Our provisions were scarce. The roof of the castle so battered there was not one dry room left in the castle. Our substance outside plundered. All our friends fled. Yet this noble lady bore it all with admirable patience. A second siege took place in the spring of 1644, and this time the Royalists prevailed and took the castle after only 3 weeks. They used mines to blow up the walls and more powerful artillery, and basically destroyed the castle. And the picture, if I go back one, that you can see there, the castle is basically, you can see it's a ruin. The other picture I'll explain in a minute. But at this point, Brilliana was dead. And in fact, she had died in the fall of 1643. One further point about the castle is that when Parliament does emerge victorious from the Civil War in 1651, the Cromwellian government, despite the fact that they don't approve of Harley's opposition to Cromwell, will nonetheless reward him with £13,000. And today's currency, if you do an estimate, it's over 4 million Canadian dollars, basically to rebuild his castle. Harley does not rebuild the castle, but what he does is he begins to build a house behind it, which is right there. So here's the castle today. This is the house that Robert Harley built, and there it is today. It's still in private hands, still in the hands of the Harleys. Edward Harley and his wife Victoria, who live there, are a prominent figure. They're prominent figures in the social life of Herefordshire today. Brilliana now as a letter writer. There again is a Vermeer picture of domestic life, a woman and her maid, a woman writing a letter. As the fuller picture of Brilliana, and there's her son Ned, to whom she will write. And there is a copy. There's another Vermeer of a woman reading a letter, and there is actually a copy of Brilliana's handwriting. If you were to blow it up, and it's very legible. And here's Brilliana's signature. Let me turn then to looking at Brilliana as a letter writer and spiritual formation in the life of her son. She was a prolific letter writer. We have about 375 of her letters, which begin in the 1620s and run all the way through to October 1643, actually a few days before her death. She would die of pneumonia. They provide a detailed picture of her married life. Her letters are often used by some PhD theses to talk about her social life, the outbreak of civil war, family at odds with the larger local political sentiments. But I want to think about the letters as a vehicle of spiritual formation. Edward, the recipient of most of the letters, went up to Magdalen Hall in Oxford University in 1638. Magdalen Hall at the time was a Puritan college, very similar to what Emmanuel College was in Cambridge. If you know anything about the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, Emmanuel College in Cambridge was a hotbed of Puritanism. And Magdalen Hall, what would become Magdalen College in Oxford, was similar. Magdalen is where C.S. Lewis, many, many years later, would teach. Her son would eventually join the parliamentary army and fight against the king with his father, etc. Well, let me read some of the letters that she writes and get a glimpse of her piety, but also a glimpse of using the vehicle of a letter as a medium of spiritual formation. This is a letter she writes on November the 2nd, 1638. So the First Bishop's War is broken out. England is sliding towards civil war, but this letter doesn't reflect any of that. It's rather an emphasis on piety. Good Ned, she writes, I was doubly glad to receive your letter, both for the assurance of your coming well to Oxford, and that I received it by your father's hand, who I thank God came well home yesterday about 4 o'clock. I'm glad you like Oxford. It is true, it is to be liked, and happy are we when we like both places and conditions that we must be in. If we could be so wise, we should find much more sweetness in our loves than we do. For certainly there is some good in all conditions, but that of sin, if we had the art to distract the sweet and leave the rest. Now I earnestly desire you may have that wisdom, that from all the flowers of learning, which he's going to be exposed to at Oxford, you may draw the honey and leave the rest. I may well say you are my well-beloved child, therefore I cannot but tell you I miss you. If you would have anything, let me know it. Be not forgetful to write to me, and the Lord in mercy bless you both with grace in your soul and the good things of your life, of this life. Your most affectionate mother till death, Brilliana Harley. And then she adds as a postscript, be careful to keep the Sabbath. The Puritans, as you know, strong Sabbatarians. Here she's basically advising her son that he needs to be discerning in what he learns in Oxford. He needs to keep what is sweet, spiritually sweet, true, and discard the rest. Also, he must have been complaining maybe about being in Oxford. He was away from home. He's at this point in time, he's 14 years old. And that's a pretty typical age for somebody to go up to Oxford or Cambridge. By the way, the BA at Oxford or Cambridge would be equivalent of a high school degree. But obviously missing home. And she's encouraging him that while she misses him deeply, she's encouraging him nonetheless to find things in Oxford that he can enjoy, etc. This is 2 weeks later. November the 13th, 1638. I beseech the Lord to bless you with those choice blessings of his spirit, which none but his dear elect are partakers of, that so you may taste that sweetness in God's service, which indeed is in it. The men of this world cannot perceive it. Think it not strange if I tell you, I think it's long since I heard from you. But my hope is that you are well, and my prayers are that you may be so. If you want anything, let me know it. I've sent you some juice of licorice, which you may make use of if you should have a cold. What is fascinating about these letters is the way she interweaves what we would describe today as mundane advice regarding our life in this world, with spiritual advice, and almost seamlessly. She begins with talking here about the importance of being blessed, the blessings that come from the indwelling of the Spirit, which only the elect know of, and that he might taste something of the sweetness of being a child of God, of which the men of this world know nothing. And then she immediately kind of seamlessly goes on to tell him, well, it's been a while since I've heard from you. She's praying for him. And then she's got this thing of licorice juice. And I'm not sure how long it would have taken somebody to get from Brampton Bryan up to Oxford, but there's no refrigeration. So the licorice juice must have been able to be preserved. And we'll see the licorice juice will come in again, but he's got some problems with his back. And she's got some advice about that too. November the 17th, 4 days later, she writes again. This day, she writes because she's received a letter from him. This day I received a letter from you in which you write me that you had written to me the week before, which letter I have not received. So I thought it long since I heard from you. The postal service is basically non-existent. And so people would employ others to take their letters if they were traveling in a certain direction. It will be later in the century that the postal service will develop. And so he may well have given it to somebody who was traveling in the general direction of Hereford. And so it may be a while for him to have the letter to have gotten to her. It is my joy that you are well, and I beseech the Lord to continue your health, and above all, to give you that grace in your soul, which may make you have a healthful soul, sound without errors, active in all that is good, industrious in all the ways in which good is to be gained. I'm glad you find a want of that ministry you did enjoy. Labor to keep a fresh desire after the sincere milk of the word, and then in good time you shall enjoy that blessing again. The Lord has promised to give his spirit to his children, which shall lead them in the truth. Beg that blessed spirit, and then errors will but make the truth more bright, as the foil, that is a background, a dark background, does a diamond. This is what the salesmen, as they sell diamonds, would often put them against a dark background to highlight the brilliance of the stone. My dear Dad, as you have been careful to choose your company, be so still, for pitch, tar, will not easily be touched without leaving some spot. I've sent you a cake, which I hope you'll eat in memory of Brampton. Again, the seamlessness of spiritual advice with more mundane. Again, as I said, I've got no idea exactly how long it would have taken to get from Brampton to Oxford, probably 2 or 3 days. So obviously the cake hopefully would have survived that long, and etc. Here again, she prays for his health, but especially the health of his soul. A healthful soul, she said. What does that mean? It's one that is sound theologically, active in good works, zealous for trying to find ways in which good is to be gained. He's been lamenting the fact that he can't find a preaching ministry in Oxford equivalent to what he had had in Herefordshire. Because of their father, because of Robert Harley's bringing gospel men into Herefordshire, there had been a number of gospel preachers, but he hasn't been able to find such a church. And she says, well, keep longing after the spiritual milk of the word. And she prays in good time he would find a minister to sit under in Oxford. And then notice she also has a reflection here on his choice of friends. Be careful to choose your company, for pitch, tar, will not easily be touched without leaving some spot. And the recognition, a mother's recognition, that one's company, one's friends, can have a blessed effect or a deleterious effect upon your soul. About 4 weeks later, she writes again, December the 11th, 1638. Again, seamless transition from mundane events to spiritual. The means to preserve health, she writes, is a good diet and exercise. And in some proportion, it is with the soul as with the body. There must be a good diet. We must feed upon the word of God, which when we have done, we must not let it idle, but we must be diligent in exercising of what we know. And the more we practice, the more we shall know. So how do you build up the soul spiritually? You need to feed upon the word of God and not simply take it in terms of reading intellectually, but you must act upon what you have read. Dear Ned, let nothing hinder you from performing constant private duties of praying and reading. And here we get one of the great Puritan emphases in terms of spirituality. The importance of prayer as a vehicle for maintaining spirituality, and the importance of reading scripture and obviously Christian books. Experimentally, she goes on. Experientially, she means. I must say that private prayer is one of the best means to keep the heart close to God. Oh, it is a sweet thing to open our hearts to God, to our God as to a friend. And again, she's interesting. The whole area of spiritual formation of her son is not simply admonition to do this and do that, but also sharing her own experience. And her own experience had been that prayer was something in which he spoke to God as a friend. And again, notice the affective element here. She uses the term sweet. There was a sweetness in it, something that was desirable and tasty, as it were, spiritually. She then concludes it this way: if it had not been for that prayer to God, that I had recourse to my God, sure, I should have fainted before this. Now, the larger background again is England is sliding towards civil war. Her position in Herefordshire is precarious. Her surrounding neighbors are Royalists. And she finds herself in many respects driven to prayer as a final recourse. 3 days later, she writes again, I remember you in my prayers as I do my own soul, for you are as dear to me as my life. And I think one of the key elements of spiritual formation in the family is the parents telling their children of their love for them. And she doesn't refrain from that. There will develop in the Victorian period in British society a kind of an emotional coldness to some degree, in which the British, particularly the English, will be very reluctant to reveal emotion and affection publicly. But this is a different world from that.
Right.
I remember you in my prayers as I do my own soul, for you are as dear to me as my life. Dear Ned, be careful to use exercise. And for that pain in your back, it may be caused by some indisposition of the kidneys. I would have you drink in the morning beer boiled with licorice. So here's the licorice juice. It's the most excellent thing for the kidneys. By the way, I have no idea whether licorice juice boiled with beer is of any value, but she obviously thought it was. The Lord, for the book, she had asked him for a book to get in Oxford, because books were much more plentiful in Oxford, numerous booksellers there. For the book, if you cannot have it in French, send it me in English. And we're not sure what book it was, but here's an indication of her disposition to read in French rather than English. The Lord in mercy, much mercy, bless you and preserve you from all evil, especially sin. January the 4th, 1639. My good Ned, nothing here below on the earth is more dear to me than your well-being. It is that I pray for and rejoice when I'm assured of it. My dear Ned, above all, the well-being of your soul is most dear to me, next to my own. Again, as I said, I think part of it, the importance of spiritual formation within the home, is the parents' communication of their love for their children, but especially their desire for their children to have souls that are healthy. Or this one, January the 14th, 1639. The Lord in mercy fill you with his grace. So she prays for him, and she tells him what she's praying. That so you may be lovely in his sight, and if you are beloved by the Lord, it is happiness enough. None are partakers of his love but his children, and he so loved them that he gave his son to die for them. Oh, that we could but see the depths of that love of God in Christ to us, then sure, love would constrain us to serve the Lord with all our hearts most willingly. And again, the reliance here, very clear reliance upon the atoning work of Christ as a demonstration of God's love for us. It's in this letter she mentions that be constant in holy duties. I believe before this you have read some part of Mr. Calvin. Send me word how you like him. So she's opening a context for her son to have communication regarding his reading, and the use of books as a vehicle of spiritual formation. And then this is one of no date. I thank you for joining with me in desiring that I might be able to go to the congregation and the beauty of holiness. Notice the way she describes going to church. It's a place where God's beauty, his holy beauty, is shining. She has not been able to go to church because she's not been well. It is true, my sweet Ned, I may truly say one thing I have desired and will seek after, that I might enjoy those sweet privileges in God's house. But since you went, I've not had that happiness. The sharpness of the weather is such as I cannot bear it so long together. I must wait under the gracious hand of my God. February 1639. Oh, it is a sweet thing to a private conference of our God, to whom we may make known all our wants, all our follies, discover all our weakness. In assurance he will supply our wants and will not upbraid us with our infirmities. Again, she's using her own experience to help Ned realize the vital importance of prayer, particularly prayer as a place of confession of sin and seeking strength to live a holy life. And two other texts and then a final, well, actually three other texts.
Yeah.
This is March the 22nd, 1639. She tells him again, I've had a time of sickness and weakness. Some scholars believe that she's talking here about a possible miscarriage and the loss of friends. And as I may say, the gliding away of all those things I took most comfort in this life. By this point, England is well on the way towards civil war. And most of the Royalist families, the aristocratic families in Herefordshire, have nothing to do with Brilliana. She talks about her servants going into town sometimes to get supplies, and the servants being upbraided by people in the local town. One of her servants went in to get supplies, and people began to yell at him. He was a Roundhead, namely a Puritan. If I should now say, which I may boldly, that in this condition, oh, how sweet did I find the love of my God and the endeavor to walk in his ways, it may be, some will say, that it must needs be so, because all my other comforts have failed me. In other words, if she says that it is sweet to walk with God now, some will say, well, you don't have anything. You've lost your friends. You've lost your standing in the community. Well, no wonder you're turning to God. But she says, my dear Ned, I must lay both my conditions together. My time of freedom from affliction, which occurred before the slide of England towards civil war, and my time of affliction, and also her own illness. In the one, I found a sweetness in the service of God above the sweetness of the things in this life. And that's the time of freedom from affliction. And in trouble, I found a sweetness in the service of God, which took away the bitterness of the affliction. And this I tell you, that you may believe how good the Lord is, and believe it as a tried truth. The service of the Lord is more sweet, more peaceful, more delightful than the enjoying of all the fading pleasures of the world. I mean, if you wanted to take a text of her confession of faith, it is this: that in the distress of physical illness and the distress of loss of friends and the distress of the social upheaval that is on the horizon, she finds her deepest comfort in the fact that she has a God who loves her, has given his son for her, to whom she can go at any time. And serving him is the sweetest, most peaceful, most delightful thing in this world of change and fading pleasures. But again, she can be very, can give mundane advice. This is May the 7th, 1639. She's got advice here regarding the color of his clothes. I like the stuff for your clothes well, but the color of those for every day, I don't like so well. So he must have been home, and she must have seen the color of his clothes. I'm not sure what the color was she didn't like. The silk shamlet, which is a shirt, I like very well, but both the color and the stuff, both the color and the material. Let your stockings be always of the same color as your clothes. And I remember being told this, that your socks shouldn't stand out from the rest of your clothing. I don't follow that advice anymore. And she says, I hope you now wear Spanish leather shoes. I have no idea why Spanish leather was better than other leather. Finally, her last extant letter, I'm jumping over here, that I have. When you get if you get the written text, you'll see there's a number of texts that I've jumped over, and you can read those. Right. I've also provided in the written text a bibliography of secondary sources and primary sources. Her last extant letter, only a few days before she died, was October the 9th, 1643. The siege had been lifted about a month before, and she told him she feared another siege. She was right, but she would not live to see it. She said in the letter, my trust is only in my God, who never yet failed me. One of the men who had helped Brilliana defend the castle, Samuel Moore, send word to her husband and to Ned that of Brilliana's death. At 6 o'clock, the Sabbath day, the sweet lady's soul went to keep the eternal Sabbath in heaven, where she can never be beseeched. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Michael. That certainly gave us some real insight into her incredible faith, and that it really took her through some difficult times. Hard for some of us to imagine what that must have been like, in fact, living those conditions and the isolation that she felt as well. Are any of her letters being republished, or is there any, like, what's the access to her material? Is that something?
There is a on Google, you can get the edition that I'm drawing from is an 1854 edition of her letters. It's never been reprinted.
Right.
And what I'd like to do is I've done this with other writings, other authors. I'd like to do an extract with a small introduction about her life, her piety, and kind of publish some of the letters there. They're gems.
Yeah.
I found her by accident. I was Googling and I forget how I came across the name. I thought, who's this?
Yeah,
and
really
found the body of letters. And then I wrote to probably the one person I think knows everything about the Puritans. I'm not a Puritan expert per se. And that's Joel Beeke. I thought Joel have heard of her for sure. Beeke, Beeke. And he's the president of Puritan Reformed Theological Seminary. At least he was. He's now chancellor there. And I wrote to Joel and I said, have you ever heard of Brilliana Harley? He'd never heard of her. He said, I've got no idea who you're talking about. Never heard of her. And I thought, well, if he hasn't heard of her, she must be very obscure. But what I found going through these are gems. These are absolute gems. Yeah. And she's not writing a spiritual treatise like, say, John Owen, one of the great Puritan leaders, or Richard Baxter, or any of the men that we know their names of. But there is as rich a piety here. And in the snippets, just gems. So I would like to try to make available some of her writings, but you can Google her, just say letters Brilliana Harley, and you'll come up with the 1854 text.
Okay.
And that has been edited because her spelling is like most 17th century writers. It's all over the map.
That's like mine, without spell check, right?
Yeah, people spelt the way they heard words, and I often tell my students, some of my students, you would have loved to have lived in the I would not be docking you for mistakes in spelling.
That's right. That came in, I guess, more in the 19th century.
Exactly.
Really.
Yeah.
Would you put her in one of these series, Michael?
I would like to put her in that series where we've done these little kind of booklets.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would like to, because I think to me it's just a remarkable godly mother. And as I said, the whole issue of the family, the importance of the family, as a place of spiritual nurture, it shines through very powerfully.
And I mean, all the responsibilities, provisioning for the castle. I mean, a lot of just business and executive talent to manage all these resources.
Yeah, she's obviously very gifted as in leadership in that way. But again, part of it is her own privileged position. She's aristocracy. She's used to commanding servants, etc.
Right.
One thing I've not been able to figure out: what on earth is her husband up to?
Yeah.
In London for he's got his poor wife for basically nearly 2 months, withstanding a siege. Like, why has he not come with? If I was her husband, I'd be getting a troop of cavalry from Cromwell and charging up to Herefordshire to relieve the castles.
I guess he had such confidence in her abilities, I guess.
I gather that, or he's so busy knocking down monuments. Anyway, I'm sure there are good reasons, but it's a big question mark, which I'd like to find out, because it's like, where is her husband in all this? Anyway.
Yeah, really. You had the interesting comment just before we started the lecture about her influence through her son and her grandson, which which you might just elaborate, because her impact was transgenerational there, really.
Yeah. So Edward becomes a significant figure in parliamentary politics in the 1660s to 1700. He will die in 1700. So this is the son to whom she writes.
Right.
He is part of the circle, the government circles around Charles II. Charles II was a very immoral king, legally married, but has about 10 to 15 illegitimate children, numerous affairs throughout England. And it was said that Edward Harley, her son, shone like a star in the firmament of this very wicked court. His son was Robert Harley, who probably is the first Prime Minister of England. He plays a very prominent role in the government of Queen Anne and King William III. He's a key figure in the execution of the Act of Union of 1707, which dissolves the Scottish Parliament and basically unites them into the British, English, and Scottish Parliament into one, which has recently been gone back, as you all know, to the dissolution of the creation of the Scottish Parliament again. But he presides over that. He'll fall from favor because of some of his politics. But again, it was said that he was a remarkably godly individual. The man that is often credited with being the first prime minister is Robert Walpole, who was a man who was deeply immoral, lived in undisguised adultery with his mistress, Molly Scarrett, used his position to accumulate a large amount of wealth, built a huge palatial mansion in Norfolk, whereas Robert Harley, the grandson of Brilliana, lived a very modest lifestyle. The house that his father built, which you saw there, is modest. It might look big to us, but it is modest compared to many of the other palaces and castles and houses of the aristocracy. And so you find that Brilliana's influence goes down at least 2 generations beyond her son, her grandson. And by the time her grandson is born, she's been dead, a good probably 20 years.
Yeah.
And but there is this influence of generations, which again reminds us of God's promise of blessing in families. So again, and it's actually Harley Street, which is a very well-known street in London. Is named after Robert Harley, her grandson.
All right. Anything to do with the Harley Davidson?
I thought about that. You never know. Yeah, I don't know.
All right. Well, there's a project.
Yeah, that's a project. Yeah.
So, but what would a Brilliana Harley look like today? What in terms, this kind of a deep spirituality, but also immense, immersion in the practical events of the day. And that point she made about she really just wants the truth. Isn't that so today too? Like she really didn't trust the information unless she got it from someone who she did trust herself. So she didn't take, and I can see how difficult it must have been at that time to get accurate sense.
Yeah, you don't have the media. You have newspapers that are coming out, but they're being written from various vantage points.
Yeah.
And so she's where she is in Brampton Bryan is fairly isolated at that time. Herefordshire was not an easy county to get to in some respects, and it's a fair distance from London. So what exactly is going on in the late 1630s and early 1640s? She makes that comment in 1641. Britain is on the verge of civil war. She's hearing rumors about what may be taking place in London, but she doesn't know exactly. And you might think, well, today we've got media, but you sometimes wonder, like, is what I'm reading on the internet, is it accurate? Is it true? I mean, et cetera, et cetera.
Indeed. Comments, questions, feel free to ask Michael anything. This stumbling upon Brilliana is relatively recent. That is in your.
Yeah, I think I've only known of her for about 2 years, 3 years.
Yeah.
So I've been working on trying to get an understanding of her life, and then this kind of selection of letters is fairly recent. Yeah.
Good. Yeah.
Dr. Haykin, I did get a chance to actually write to her relative an email, and she responded. And her letters are in the reading room collection at the British Library. So haven't quite made that trip yet, but
Okay.
that's where they're located, the actual documents.
Okay. Wow. So this would be, was it Victoria Harley that wrote to you back, or a secretary?
I want to say it was Susan, but I'll have to go back in my emails and check.
Okay, so that's probably the Edward of Victoria, who is he's the current Earl of Oxford.
Yeah.
Because that's a position that her grandson is given. He's got to be in his 70s, 80s. So this is probably a daughter or granddaughter. Wow, that's great.
It was cool that she responded.
Yeah, I'm going to England this summer, but I'm going to be in Norfolk. And I was trying to map out how can I get over to Brampton Bryan just even to see the place, but it's like a 5-hour trip.
You need to rent a car. I kind of Google mapped it myself, trying to figure it out. And like, there's no trains that go there. You'd have to take a taxi or have your own car.
Yeah. Do a field trip. The interesting, in the flyer, if you didn't get the flyer for us to talk, but I'll send it also in an email, there's a link to a dissertation that was written in 2010 at actually Department of English at Penn State. It's called House and Children, Lady Brilliana Harley and the Expansion of Domestic Agency. An interesting cut. That's available. If you click on the link, you get the full dissertation. So that's an interesting lead.
Yeah, it's a very nice little dissertation because it's about 30 pages and it gives an overview of her life. And it's very helpful in a very short span.
Right.
It was a BA thesis.
Yeah.
But it's a very helpful little kind of study. Yeah.
You wonder how this Julia Covelli came across that as a topic, or it just seems to pop. I've never seen it.
Yeah, I think what has happened in the last 25, 30 years with the growth of feminist historians, there has been a plumbing of resources back in a variety of areas. And so I found work on Brilliana in a number of academic journals.
Okay.
So I probably got, half a dozen to 8 or 10 academic articles on Brilliana, and about 3 or 4 other theses. There are about 2 or 3 other PhD theses. But it's very much within a very narrow range of scholarship. Scholars who are specializing in women's religious experience in the early 17th century. And it's yet to reach. I think there's jewels here for God's people in general, but it's yet to reach kind of a public understanding of her life. Yeah,
make a good movie, I think.
Oh yeah, I mean, there actually are 2 films on the Siege of Brampton Bryan.
Okay.
Yep, they're each 10-minute long. They're kind of you can find them on YouTube. In my paper, I give the address of the 2 films.
Yep. All right.
There are a lot of in America. There's a lot of reenactors doing the American Civil War. Well, you've got the same thing in Britain. All these men going out, spending a weekend, pretending that they were living in the Civil War times, and so they've got a bunch of reenactors reenacting the Siege of Brampton Bryan.
Okay. Well, that's other question. Oh, you'll certainly get all this. Make sure your email's in the chat, and I will get the Michael's presentation. Quite a detailed paper with lots of references, so I think you'll really get into it, and the PowerPoint slides as well, which are very informative. But I think that's certainly a good place, and there are many more. I would think Puritan women and their role. He talks about the dissertation domestic agency, but how central the home was as a place for industry, for education. Like the women really, in those contexts, had immense influence. Far cry from the domestic home of the later 19th century, which is kind of reduced in its scope. Is kind of turning in on itself rather than being part of the culture, if that's correct. But anyway, that's most helpful, Michael, and certainly indication of just how much there is yet there to uncover from our heritage, Christian heritage, of these amazing lives that God transformed and did amazing things through very difficult times and circumstances. I don't think any of us really would quite, have a sense of how difficult that must have been. And separated from her husband and then her son, and yet the effectiveness of those letters was very important, clearly in shaping his life as well. So, thank you very much for bringing that up
David,
to our attention.
I don't know. Did you have a, good to see you. Did you have a question?
I was trying to listen for books that she may have read. Your paper mentioned one she was going to order, get it in French, if not in English, but we didn't know what book. Was there a library or any context what books she might have been reading to herself develop her faith?
Yeah, she's got Calvin's Institutes.
All right.
She mentions that a number of times that she's reading the Institutes. That's a very good question, and it's something I should probably detail. There are a number of other Puritan writers she mentions. She's also got a Life of Luther. She talks about Luther's life as God raising Luther up as a trumpet. She has a disagreement. You'll see in the text, the letters I quote, she's got a disagreement with Calvin on an issue, and I'm pretty certain it's the issue of the Sabbath, because Calvin, if you recall, is not a classical Sabbatarian. He argues that the Lord's Day is not the Sabbath.
Right.
She disagrees with him on that. So she's not afraid to. Also, this is very interesting too. She's not afraid to, to disagree with giants of the faith that everybody else would have.
Yeah.
If he said it, it's right. So so she's reading Calvin's Institutes. There are, and that's a very good point. That reminds me that I should probably include something about other Puritan writers. She mentions one or two others who I forget at this point. They're not major figures. And then she's got a Life of Luther she's read. There probably would have been a library at Brampton Castle, but it almost definitely would have been destroyed during the siege.
Yeah. And I know that John Owen would be in.
Well, Owen hasn't written anything at this point.
Okay, he's still
Owen's career
after.
He's just gone up. He's in London in 1643.
Okay,
1642. He leaves he's the chaplain to a man named Lord Lovelace, and he goes to London when war breaks out because Lovelace is a royalist. And I think 1643, 44, he writes a book against Arminianism. He reads John Cotton's Keys of the Kingdom in 1644, 45. So Owen hasn't written anything.
Yeah.
So if she's reading stuff, it would be earlier Puritans like Richard Greenham, maybe Richard Sibbes. There are as you all know, there's a huge host of names that are very obscure to us today that were much more commonly known then.
Right.
So I know when I was going through her letters to do the selection I've got, that I came across two or three other Puritan authors he mentions. I didn't know who they were, and the letter itself didn't indicate wasn't one that I wanted to include. But I need to go back and track through the letters and try to build. Okay, what was she reading besides the scriptures?
Right. Yeah. Yeah, that certainly would be very informative as well. So I think you can keep us posted on your progress there. You're going to be in England in the summer?
Yeah, I will. But I as I as I was mentioning, Norfolk is, well, it's not the furthest point away from Brampton Bryan, but it would be a 4-hour trip at a minimum, and I don't think I'll be able to make that. The knowledge that they're in the British Library, that might be might be able to get down to London and go to the British Library for a day.
And you're guess what will you be researching when you're in England?
Well, actually, it's a PhD seminar I'm leading on 18th century Baptists.
All right.
And in Norfolk. Norfolk was a bastion of British descent. Presbyterians, well, mostly Baptist Congregationalists, and a lot of the Puritans in New England come from Norfolk. The Boston accent is traceable back to Norfolk.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
All the accents in North America are traceable to various parts of the UK.
All right.
and Ireland.
Okay.
And New England is what's called East Anglia, Norfolk and Suffolk.
Interesting. Yeah, fascinating.
But she's at the opposite side of that. She's right next to Wales.
Okay. Well, I should also mention, for those of you who don't subscribe, Michael's Historia Ecclesiastica is a wealth of information. I don't know where you find the time to write all these articles, Michael, but they're very informative. Everything from Constantine through to the present, but just illuminating in many respects, and so that'll be included in the note follow up to you as well. That basically where you could subscribe to Michael's Substack, and highly recommended. It just brings to light various aspects of church history from the beginnings through to present that are not well known, or that should be more well known. But okay, any other questions or comments? I would like to thank you, Michael, for your time and the incredible amount of work you did in pulling this together. And I think you'll see that when you get the paper. It's a significant piece of scholarship.
Welcome.
All right, well, look, a pleasure. David, sometime I'll have to chat with you about some of the common. I was certainly very close to the Reformed Baptist early 70s in the Hamilton, Burlington area. So we have some common connections. I know Michael and I discovered that as well. So wonderful. Well, thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you.
And
thank you, everyone.
This is recorded as well, so there will be a recording available on the Oak Center website, and there are a number of other lectures and talks there as well that you may find informative. So pleasure meeting a number of you, and we will keep in touch. And Michael, all the best. We'll probably chat again soon. All right, blessings, everyone.
God bless.
Thank you.
Thank you.